Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello everyone et bonsoir à toutes ceux et celles qui sont en Europe. Good evening for everybody who is currently in European time zone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une nouvelle conférence virtuelle de l'initiative IA et Société. I am delighted to welcome you today for a new AI and Society virtual talk. For those who don't know me, I am Florian Martin Barreto. I am the director of the AI and Society Initiative. I am an associate professor and the University of Ottawa Research Chair in Technology and Society, and I am also the director of the University Center for Law, Technology and Society. For today's virtual talk, I'm joined by Petra Molnar, a lawyer and a researcher specializing in migration and technology and human rights, and the associate director of the Refugee Law Laboratory at York University. And today she will discuss some of the findings of a new collaborative report with EDRI that she published a few weeks ago titled Technological Testing Grounds, Migration Management Experiment from the Ground Up. And so the report was published last month, and it looked at the impact of migration control technologies, of the use of AI at the border and their impact on the lives of people, especially on the move in Greece and around the Mediterranean corridor. And so for that conversation around that very timely report and important report on the use of AI at the border, Petra will be joined by my colleague, Jamie Liew, who is an immigration and refugee lawyer and an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Jamie will facilitate the conversation around the report and will provide Petra with the question that you may ask, you may want to ask to her. And so to do so, please use the conversation option in Teams. So you will see on your screen, either in the middle or at the top, there is a chat bubble. You can just click on it. The conversation tab will open and you can ask your question there. And then Professor Liew will read them and discuss them with our speaker. Without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Petra and Jamie. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Florian. I'm honored to be here today, and I wanted to thank you and your team for the kind invitation. I just wanted to note that I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk with Petra Molnar, a friend, a fellow lawyer, and also an amazing researcher, as you'll discover through our conversation today, in the area of technology and migration. So welcome, Petra. I wanted to start our conversation by asking you how you got interested in this current research of technology, how it surveys migrants, and particularly your focus on the happenings and the intersection of migration and technology in Europe. For those of us who might be wondering, how did this intersection come to you and how you got interested in it?
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie, and merci, Florian, and everyone else for inviting me today. Great question. I mean, I like to start off by saying that I am not a tech person. I'm a lawyer specializing in migration issues for many years now. And before I was a lawyer, I was a refugee settlement worker. So I've been working with communities that have been displaced for a while. But quite by accident, a colleague of mine by the name of Lex Gill and I started looking at issues around technology and migration in 2018. And we came across this pilot project that the Canadian government was wanting to look at, essentially automating various facets of our immigration and refugee processing system. And so it was quite by accident we came across a procurement notice that was calling for what they were terming artificial intelligence solutions in a variety of immigration applications. And that really kind of piqued our interest and made us quite worried from the human rights perspective, because very little governance and regulation existed at the time, and in a way still exists today, when it comes to new technologies that are used in migration management. So I started looking at those issues there, and then over the last few years, I've expanded it to try and understand how this kind of ecosystem that has grown around migration management technology operates on the ground. And some of the images that you are seeing now are from my most recent visit to the Lesbos island here in Greece. I'm actually joining you from Athens today. We were there to try and document what is happening on the ground and to kind of situate some of this thinking that I've been doing in real world examples. So that's kind of how I got into it, quite by accident.
Thank you, Petra. That is very interesting. It's always funny to hear the origin stories of people's research projects and the issues that they care about. As you said, you're currently in Greece conducting research there, not only on the tools that states are using to survey persons, but you are doing research also on the European Union's Migration Pact, how they are using particular tools to criminalize and segregate migrants. And I wondered if you could first talk about this context. Can you first explain what is the EU's Migration Pact?
Absolutely, and thanks for that, Jamie. I mean, it's really, really important to look at the context in which these technologies are developed and deployed. And in particular, in the European Union context, again, trying to understand how discourses around criminalization of migration, xenophobia, and this increasing anti-migrant sentiment is playing out, both in the way that technologies are experienced on the ground, but also in policy and law. And so the new Migration Pact is something that was released just a few months ago. It's essentially a set of policies and thinking around how the European Commission and the European Union is responding to the migration situation right now. And it was a series of documents that was released en masse, as these things usually go. And one of the first things I always do is try and do, the kind of like Control F, research methodology, I guess you could say, to try and see how these documents interplay with surveillance and tech. And so, searching in massive amounts of pages to try and see, whether different technological tools are used. And lo and behold, this set of regulations and laws and policies mentions explicitly, a few really interesting ways I think that are pertinent to our conversation today. One of them being, for example, the framing around migration policy at the European Union level around border enforcement, around the securitization that we've been seeing over the last number of years, expanding the mandate of entities like Frontex, which is kind of the border police force, for lack of a better word. And also, interestingly, when it comes to new technologies, importing some of this into the thinking of the European Union and focusing, for example, on pilot projects around facial recognition at the border, including on minors. That was actually written into the pact, into one of the documents, which I find really fascinating and interesting that these particular examples are the ones that we are choosing to focus on in this space. I mean, this migration pact will be debated, and it will take some time to see how the actual proposals will filter down in terms of the actual kind of regulatory regime of migration management in Europe, but it is telling that in these early phases, in a package that was supposed to be very revolutionary, but in fact actually just strengthens really kind of draconian hardline border enforcement over, let's say, refugee protection and kind of human dignity and complexity of the migration experience. It's quite telling that these examples have made it in there.
I mean, for those of us that are watching your photos as well, I mean, there's so much happening on the ground. And I wondered if you could also give further contextual guidance as to where these pictures are from. You recently had a chance to visit a refugee camp on the island of Lesbos, and how this intersects with this research you're doing on technology and surveillance of migrants. Tell us a little bit more about what we're looking at.
Yeah, thank you. These powerful photos are by an incredible colleague of ours, Kenya Jade Pinto, who's actually an alumna of the University of Ottawa, and a lawyer, a filmmaker, and a photographer. So Kenya Jade joined me here in Greece in September, and quite, nobody knew that the Moria camp was going to burn down, of course, but we were here already to try and document how the kind of surveillance regime is being experienced by people who are on the move, and also some of the discourses around how this kind of securitization, increase of technology is playing out. And then the camp burned in early September, and it was a moment for us to be able to go there and try and witness and hold space and talk to people about their experiences, both, in their migration journey, but also in terms of how they've experienced this kind of increased surveillance and automation and new technologies at the border and beyond the border. I mean, I should say we were conflicted about going because, when you work in these spaces, your positionality is really important to interrogate. And as two Canadian lawyers, we were really conscious of not taking up too much space in this kind of crisis moment. But we really wanted to make sure that we were there to listen to people and to do this kind of slow, deep, more ethnographic data collection and story collection. And I think in the end it was really good that we were there, because essentially we witnessed the birth of a new containment camp. So essentially what happened was thousands of people were displaced. They were essentially cordoned off in this road where eventually they were tear gassed, and the movement was really controlled. And then they were essentially kind of moved into this new camp that was hastily constructed over the matter of a couple of days on this windswept peninsula where it was so close to the sea, like if you stick your hand out, you can touch the water. This camp is not winterized. This was back in September. It's now early December, and people are really worried about what the next few months are going to be like. Yes, this is a mild Mediterranean climate. I know I'm talking to mostly Canadians, so our weather here is a bit different, but still, I mean, it gets quite cold at night. People don't have access to running water or adequate heating or food. And, just to bring this back to the technology and surveillance piece, where does that fit in, right? I mean, we're talking about a humanitarian emergency, a new camp, a new detention center, essentially. But we already, before this even happened, saw this kind of appetite on part of these frontier states that are kind of Europe's shield. That's sometimes how they're conceptualized and talked about. They really become these testing grounds for new technologies. And this kind of fervent use of surveillance and this kind of obsession with automation, whether or not it actually works, is a separate conversation. Trying to track these discourses, I think, is really important, because as you see from some of the photos, we really are talking about a fairly horrific situation with humanitarian implications. And yet these are the spaces where drone usage is increasingly being documented, talks of biometrics, all sorts of other types of automation. And again, very little governance and even oversight exists around this particular use of technology. And the concern now is too that, technology, of course, is not neutral. It replicates power relations. It marginalizes certain communities that are not able to participate in conversations around innovation. And in this COVID moment as well, we have to ask ourselves, are the technologies that are being developed right now, how can they be co-opted or weaponized against people that are kind of already on the margins? And unfortunately, this is exactly what we have been seeing. Rise of surveillance technologies that are sometimes based around automation, facial recognition systems that are inherently racist and unable to deal with faces of color. Again, the context matters. We're talking about immigration, where decision-making is already very opaque and discretionary. And the fact that we are seeing this rise of this kind of panopticon of migration technologies is really worrying.
Thank you, Petra. That is a perfect segue into my next question. You spoke a little bit about drones, facial recognition, biometrics, but I wondered if you could go deeper and describe exactly what kinds of technologies are being used in migration contexts, for what purpose, and how they're being used.
So in our work, we take a kind of a systemic approach to try and understand, again, how this kind of ecosystem of migration management technology operates. And I'll share a link to our report, which kind of goes into more depth around this. But when we're talking about migration management technologies, we're really talking about this kind of class of technologies that is introduced to control migration, act in certain ways around the border and even beyond the border. So the one way I like to talk about it is kind of trace a person's migration journey. So there's a set of things that can happen before you even cross the border. That can be, things like scraping your social media data for a variety of purposes, sometimes counterterrorism, sometimes other purposes. Population tracking in humanitarian emergencies is increasingly relying on big data, for example, by international organizations that are kind of at the forefront of the humanitarian response. at the border, we are increasingly seeing more of these kind of surveillance type manifestations. So unpiloted drones, aerostat machines that rely on automation and a variety of other tools. For example, at the US-Mexico border, we've been seeing, even before the Trump administration, this rise of kind of the smart border technology regime, looking at, for example, thermal cameras, again, drone usage is quite endemic. And then, more lately, we've been seeing really, really interesting and quite problematic kind of pilot projects that have been coming up. So, for example, here in the European Union, a project that got quite a lot of media attention eventually was called the iBorder Control Project, which essentially was a quote-unquote AI lie detector or a risk scoring mechanism that purportedly would use facial recognition and micro expressions to determine whether someone was more likely than not to tell the truth at the border. I mean, for me as a refugee lawyer, I find this example really worrying and troubling because we, for example, know that people have different ways of communicating across different cultures. So how can an AI lie detector deal with these differences in cross-cultural communication, for example? Or even more troublingly, we know that the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that people don't recall things in a linear way. And I mean, Jamie, you know this, you're a refugee lawyer as well. Judges and human decision makers struggle with the idea of how to tell whether or not someone is telling the truth. And actually, even the traditional lie detectors, the ones that kind of go like this, they're even not admissible in courts of law in a variety of jurisdictions. So I think it's really troubling, and it's also interesting that these new so-called lie detectors are kind of being piloted out there in these really specific places. The question is why? Why are we experimenting on particular communities when it comes to this new technology? And so this is the kind of stuff that happens at the border. And then even beyond the border, we're now seeing an increased use of, for example, algorithmic decision-making in visa applications, voice analyses for a variety of reasons and the like. So really, I think, again, having a systemic kind of look at how this all operates is really useful because it allows us to kind of track the impacts of this technology on a person's journey as they move across borders.
Thank you, Petra. That is amazing. And I think it is really interesting that all of this is happening and we might not be fully aware of the extent or the kinds of tools that are being used. And I can say from personal experience, being in the immigration bar, some of us have, only learned of these things when we receive a record or receive reasons from a decision that our client has obtained, and then we learn, oh, guess what? This kind of technology was used in the decision-making process, or this is what they were subject to. So, and then this speaks to your point earlier, where you said there's very little oversight and accountability. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, that sometimes we're finding out about these things accidentally or in very haphazard, ad hoc ways. What, if any, oversight or accountability mechanisms are there? Are state governments making decisions about what technology to use? Is there any consideration for whether or not they have collateral or harmful consequences outside of the goals that states are considering and whether or not they are going to be using these particular technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the lack of governance, this kind of governance gap, is something that's quite concerning and troubling because, like you say, the use of this technology in particular contexts and that kind of contextual specificity and these high-risk applications really matters. Because right now, whether you look at it at the national level, regional level, or international level, there is very little governance and regulation, and even transparency around kind of what is happening. Like you said, Jamie, it's not even just lawyers, but it's the people themselves. It's all of you crossing borders. It's people who are claiming refugee protection. Oftentimes, people don't even know that this technology is either being tested out or actually fully enforced. And I think that's a real problem for the administration of justice and the kind of expectations that we as individuals have when it comes to. And the lack of transparency is becoming more and more kind of seen as a problem as we as societies are having conversations around automation generally, not even just in the immigration space. I mean, these conversations are starting to happen more and more, which I think is a good sign. But again, from that governance and regulatory perspective, there is a real lack of, conversations around what this could actually look like. And part of that, I think, is this tension that sometimes comes from the technology side of things and from people who are developing the tech itself. There's a concern that regulation and governance will stifle innovation, which I think is a fair point, but I will counter that with, why are we innovating in these high risk areas first, right? Because I think it's, again, important to look at it from a context specific perspective. And politics also play into this. States and bigger entities that kind of set the agenda sometimes have a stake in how particular technological development occurs and which communities kind of become testing grounds for technology. And unfortunately, what we are seeing time and time again is that it's communities that have historically been made marginalized, communities that don't really have a way to meaningfully participate in the conversations around innovation. These are the people that are kind of on the margins, tested upon before technology is rolled out somewhere else. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, are we okay with that? Are we okay with experimenting in these high risk applications? I'm not saying we shouldn't be, thinking about innovation. And of course, as an immigration lawyer myself, I know how inefficient the system is. But why are we doing it in a space where very little oversight and accountability exists, particularly when the stakes are very high? And I get a lot of pushback sometimes from the tech community. It's like, oh, you're just fear mongering, like we need to just innovate for innovation's sake and then figure it out later. But the problem is, this isn't just a theoretical exercise. There are now cases that are documented where, for example, algorithmic decision making went wrong and it had adverse consequences on people's lives. In the UK, for example, 7,000 students were wrongfully deported because an algorithm made a mistake and accused them of cheating on a language test. That's 7,000 lives that were affected. This isn't some sort of theoretical exercise. I really think we need to think about what kind of mechanisms are in place for people, first of all, to know what is happening. Second of all, how can we challenge things that go wrong? And also, we need to have a broader conversation around whether we are okay with certain types of technology. Are we okay with facial recognition on minors at the border? Why is that in the Migration Pact, for example? And again, how do we feel about it?
Thank you, Petra. I think it's very apt to point out that it is basically experiments that are happening at the border, and even to just raise that question of why is it happening there, and could it be because it is easy to make invisible, it's easy to conduct these without, as you said, oversight or accountability. But I think, as you said, it's very important to point out the vulnerability, the marginalization of the communities that these technologies are being used on. And I wanted to go back to a point that you raised earlier. You spoke a lot about the context in Europe, but these experiments at the borders are happening not just in Europe, but all over the world to different degrees. Can you speak about the urgent need to pay attention to this right now, given that it appears to be a kind of technological arms race out there? Could you speak to that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think having a global understanding of how this all fits together is really useful, because technology travels across borders very easily as well. And it can be developed in one jurisdiction, used in a second one, and then reapplied in a completely different context in the third one. And again, this gets at what we were just talking about, this lack of governance when it comes to these use cases. So having an understanding of how this kind of panopticon of technology is currently being experienced at and around the border, globally speaking, is key, because you're absolutely right. I mean, there's cases pretty much everywhere. And also, the conversation has largely been, again, a very Western kind of global North centered conversation. I think we need to look at how these technologies are being experimented with in other parts of the world as well. And actually, just to plug a recent project that we are starting, we are launching this initiative called the Migration and Technology Monitor, which is a collective of journalists and academics and filmmakers, and Kenya Jade, who took these amazing photos, to do precisely that, to monitor and track how this type of technology is playing out across borders all around the world, to try and unpack, again, how these use cases are quite high risk and problematic in certain instances, and again, to kind of strengthen our awareness and the kind of knowledge sharing that needs to happen around how pervasive a lot of this tech development and deployment is without governance and oversight.
Thank you, Petra. You do such a good job of basically outlining the kinds of technologies that are used, the potential consequences on vulnerable persons, persons that are at the margins. I wondered if you could outline the recommendations that you propose in your very new report, and whether you could tie that into the findings that you had made, that you spoke of earlier today.
Thanks. Yeah, recommendations are always the hardest part of any report. I find they're really hard to actually kind of codify, when it comes to the things that you find on the ground or in your research, particularly for policymakers, or oftentimes don't want to read another 40-page report. Like, they'll just read your executive summary and your 2-page recommendations. So you have to make them kind of punchy and snappy. In our recent report, we focused it mostly kind of on the European Union, but it's applicable, I think, globally. And the first recommendation is a call for a moratorium on high-risk applications of technology at the border, until and unless we have some sort of regulatory mechanism in place and some sort of governance conversation. Because again, the ramifications of this particular use of technology are really far-reaching. And yet, like you say, we've been seeing this kind of technological arms race happen at the global level, and it's kind of free-for-all, particularly when it comes to these frontier spaces where these technologies are playing out. So again, our number one recommendation would be basically a moratorium of certain technologies that have these far-reaching impacts. But then we also call for increased mechanisms around transparency and accountability, independent oversight when it comes to the use and the development and deployment of algorithmic decision-making, for example, in immigration applications. And that can take many shapes or forms. And Canada's been thinking, I think, quite for a while now around how to actually make this workable, whether it's algorithmic impact assessments, whether it's, frequent oversight checks and things like that. But I really do think we need this at the international level as well. And then one of our other recommendations is to really think about what does meaningful participation in these conversations look like when it comes to the communities that are most affected. We do a lot of talking about communities without the communities themselves. And, I think what we tried to highlight in the report in particular were the perspectives of people who are crossing borders. How do they feel about this technology? What are their thoughts about it? And again, as people who are kind of at the sharp edges of this technological development, for me, it's quite telling that, people are not part of the conversations that they need to be a part of. I think it's very easy to be kind of in your kind of tech bubble and develop these tools and these solutions and, look at these government procurement notices in an abstract way, but they do play out in very real ways on people's lives. And people who are kind of at the edges of this technological development need to be brought into the conversation. Because it's not just about, oh, this technology is bad, this technology is good, but it's also about participation, and it's about who gets to actually shape the conversation and which perspectives and priorities matter. And this is, I think, perhaps a good point to bring in also the interests of the private sector. Because oftentimes the public sector, states and countries and governments are not able to develop this technology in-house. They need the private sector to do this for them. But the problem is, from a responsibility and then governance perspective, the private sector and the public sector are regulated quite differently. And this can create kind of an accountability gap. And again, it's for me, it's quite telling too, because there's a lot of money to be made in border enforcement technology. And this again plays into who gets to set the stage around which questions matter, what are we innovating for, what are we optimizing for? For example, why are we not using, algorithmic decision making to root out racism at the border and figure out, which decision makers are really discriminatory? Why are we using algorithmic decision making for these dubious AI lie detectors? That in and of itself is a question I think that we have to ask ourselves. Whose priorities actually are setting the agenda?
Oh, that's very illuminating, Petra. I want to take the time to thank you for the immense amount of research you've done on this area to bring to light this very timely piece in the conversations around migration and how we manage it and the human rights of persons, really. So at this time, I want to open up the conversation to questions that our attendees may have, and I invite you to type your questions in the conversation box. You can click on the conversation tab at the top of your window, and I'll certainly read your questions to Petra, who has generously given us her time today and to speak about this timely. So we have a question here from Florian. Do you think that a country, any country gets it right? Is there an example out there where we should be leaning towards, or an approach that exists out there that you would perhaps point to?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, I think it gets at some of these broader ideas too around how kind of atomized it's all become when it comes to border enforcement, national security, and how different countries kind of position themselves. I mean, I think a lot of these questions that I've been trying to raise are quite universal in the sense that there is very little oversight and accountability globally speaking. And unfortunately, again, the context in which we find ourselves really matters. The fact that we are seeing an increase of criminalization of migration, xenophobia, rise of anti-migrant sentiments, kind of the world over. I mean, we can look at the Trump administration, but really everywhere. It's across the EU, even with certain administrations in Canada, we've had really kind of anti-immigrant sentiments make their way into policymaking. And unfortunately, I think that's the way that we are turning. And what we've been trying to track and document is how this class of technologies unfortunately exacerbates that. I mean, I think, I do think that, for example, Canada has been leading on questions around algorithmic accountability with, for example, the algorithmic impact assessment tool that's now a government binding directive on all federal departments that want to use algorithmic decision making in their applications. But again, it's very new, and we need time to see whether this kind of tool is enough and how enforceable it really is. Particularly because when it comes to immigration and immigration decision making, oftentimes, and Jamie will know this very well, this national security nexus also is something to think about, because immigration and national security go hand in hand. But as soon as you start talking about national security, that really kind of shuts down the conversation around oversight and transparency. And unfortunately, this is something that we've already been seeing too. So I think this is a very much kind of a stay tuned question, because I have yet to see some kind of good use cases when it comes to border technology in this particular space.
If I may ask a question, and I invite others to not be shy. Please type your questions into the conversation box. We have another question here. What would you say in response to people who tend to argue that implementing AI is the only way to help with the urgent and lacking manpower currently occurring at many borders?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this is a very important question, because it gets at the kind of inefficiency and issues that are really real when it comes to immigration decision making, borders, and things like that. And again, as someone who used to practice immigration law, I really now do just mostly research. I have seen firsthand at how inefficient and slow and difficult the system is in its current incarnation. But I guess I would like to push this a step further and say, I am quite uncomfortable with replacing an inefficient, broken, discriminatory, oftentimes racist system with a kind of band-aid solution that somehow presupposes that these technological tools are better positioned to help us deal with bias, discrimination, and efficiency. And, sometimes efficiency is what we want, but I guess the question is, do we also want more humanity? Do we want more ways to deal with the complexity of human experience and the human migration story? Because I think this is really what we need. We need more human dignity at the center of it. But I know, I mean, there's a tension there, because of course our systems are quite overstretched, and it's difficult to deal with large numbers of applications, for example. But again, I think this kind of the hubris of the big tech world and this kind of allure of quick fixes really doesn't get at the structural problems of why people maybe migrate in the first place, or why they seek refugee protection, or again, this kind of context I think is really, really important. So that's not to say that there aren't maybe use cases where automation could be really useful. But what I'm trying to say is, why are we seeing it in these high-risk applications time and time again? I think that's really the question to interrogate here.
We also have another question here. The use of these technologies seems to be increasing the amount of mistrust to the other and just the general sense of insecurity with the other. Do you think it is possible to use these technologies to increase true security?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I mean, definitely this kind of othering is something that, even just from like a theoretical perspective, is something that is very problematic and troubling when it comes to migration control and migration enforcement, because a lot of migration policy is built on this idea of us versus them, us versus the other. And, now even in the pandemic, this is something that has kind of unfortunately come up too. The other, the refugee, the migrant is something to be managed and controlled, and this doesn't really play out in the way that we need it to. And I think this, again, the securitization of borders and migration is such a problematic trope that we are seeing make its way into policymaking and now in tech development, because it conflates, I think, again, the human experience. I think there's a way to focus on cases that, conversations around national security, counterterrorism, and all of that. I think that the numbers don't really bear out. Of course, there's always going to be cases like that. There's always going to be cases of fraud and misrepresentation. But what is quite troubling, again, and Jamie has done work on this as well, what we've been seeing time and time again, even this pre-AI era, this conflation between people who migrate and fraud and misrepresentation and terrorism and security. And so I think we need to unpick that a little bit, because again, we are kind of painting a huge community and population with a broad brush. And unfortunately, again, this kind of use of technology is just used to kind of paper over the complexity of people's experience, and is used to kind of securitize the migration journey without actually interrogating why that's happening in the first place.
Thank you, Petra. Another question here. Are there any mechanisms to regulate how technologies are being introduced into refugee camps from outside the country? And if that technology is being introduced outside of Greece, can that country be held responsible?
That's an excellent question, and that really gets at why it's really difficult to figure out what a regulatory mechanism could look like. Because as this question points out, there are many players that are kind of inherent in this kind of ecosystem that we are talking about. Because absolutely, you're seeing, if, for example, Greece, right? So you have this particular country that has been dealing with a huge amount of people that have come since 2015. Its resources are overstretched. Then you have international organizations that come and do a lot of the management of everyday living, for example. And then you have the kind of tech sector that is making its way into this space. But it's really tricky. It is very difficult from a governance and regulatory perspective to figure out what is the appropriate way to try and regulate this. Do we do it at the national level, regional level, international level? Where do international organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees or the World Food Programme, where do they fit in? And when you ask about whether countries can be held responsible, the problem right now is there isn't really a mechanism to which to pin that responsibility to. So in the European Union, for example, we have what's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a fairly robust legal instrument for data protection issues. But there's only one article, Article 12, that talks about automated decision making. And it doesn't really get at the kind of crux of the problem. And I think, for those of you who are interested in law and regulation, this area is going to be one to watch, because in the coming years, I anticipate that there will be many more cases that are going to be brought forward, particularly on these grounds. In the EU, there was just one recently in the Netherlands that was looking at a welfare algorithm and a fraud algorithm that was successfully struck down on discrimination grounds. In the UK, just recently, there was a case that was basically that got the visa algorithm that the Home Office was using to be struck down before it actually even went to court. They pulled that as soon as the case kind of got started. So I think, we are seeing an increased kind of thought being put into how we can litigate some of this, how we can regulate it, but it is very early days. But this is, I think, the next kind of frontier of human rights and litigation. And I think we will have a lot of work to do when it comes to trying to pin responsibility and figure out how we're actually going to regulate and govern this, and what we can reasonably expect as people who are increasingly facing automation in all facets of life, not just in immigration.
Yeah, your talk has actually made me think of an interesting legal question. I mean, this is happening already in the immigration system where, for example, economic migrants apply through, a web-based application system. And in some cases, this takes away the possibility to have the decision judicially reviewed in the future, because it's an automated decision that has no discretion. It's not a discretionary decision, so it's really difficult to review such a decision in a legal setting, and essentially kind of cuts out that avenue of oversight or appeal or review in a judicial setting. And I wonder, are you seeing these kinds of things happening in other contexts at the border, for example? Are these decisions now outside the purview of judicial review because they're not seen as discretionary, and there's very little to grab onto for a judicial oversight, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a conversation for the legal eagles in the room, for sure, when it comes to how we're actually going to be able to think about this from a legal perspective when cases are being built up, and what kind of, discretionary decision making there even is in this space. It's something I think that we really need to think about, because let's say that, you personally are affected by something like, an economic migration application, or that case that I mentioned of the students being wrongfully deported. Let's say you want to actually challenge that. How would you be challenging that decision when we just don't really understand how decisions are made, when automated decision making is used to augment or even replace humans in that kind of chain of decision making that occurs in any given immigration application? It's really difficult, because I think judges and the judiciary is going to really have to grapple with, and I don't really know how this is going to go. It's going to be quite an interesting time, I think. And there have been a few cases out there, not so much in immigration, but in the criminal justice context. For example, in the US, there was a sentencing algorithm that was found to be discriminatory, the Compass algorithm, if anybody wants to look that up. But again, I mean, I think from that kind of nitty-gritty legalistic understanding of how this is going to work, it's going to be quite fascinating to see what even just standard of review will look like. What does a reasonable decision maker look like when we are augmenting a human decision making? I think the parameters of this are so kind of far out from the kind of thinking around administrative legal principles that it's going to take us a while to parse through this. And the only way I think we will do that is through court cases that challenge these algorithms. And I think this is the future. I think this is coming in the next few years.
Yeah, this is fascinating. We have time for one more question, which is what are mechanisms to collect data without objectifying the refugee community to demonstrate the impact of the type of technologies that you've discussed on the refugee community? And would that evidence be admissible in court?
This is a really great question, and it gets at something that I always like to think about when I'm doing these projects and thinking about what impactful research can look like. Because I think methodology, when it comes to working with communities that have been historically made marginalized, is super key. And I think working slowly and working with community partners on the ground who have the local expertise is really key to get around this question around objectification. And it's interesting that this particular photo is up right now, because I think it goes to some of the thinking that we have been doing for this broader project around even just things like visual representation. So in our work, we really make a commitment, for example, to not perpetuate this kind of poverty porn that we often see in forced migration settings. Taking pictures of people and their faces and tying them to particular media stories or reports. We, for example, don't photograph anyone's face unless we have their express permission or they are part of the project long term. So, for example, this was a group of youths that I met in the camp. They really wanted to talk. They really wanted to share their experiences, but we didn't feel comfortable, for example, showing their faces, because you never really know what that photo might be used for later. And again, it perpetuates this kind of almost voyeuristic way that people have been dealing with this particular community. And this is just something that I think is really important to mention, the kind of visual representation and the choices that get made when particular issues are talked about. But that also goes to working slowly and working perhaps with a more kind of ethnographic methodology in mind. Returning time and time again and being based in particular settings is, I think, really important to involve, again, communities that we are talking about directly in the design of the research itself. And whether or not this would be admissible in court, I mean, depends kind of what is being collected and for what purposes. I will say that a part of the project that I mentioned that we are just starting is to potentially look at strategic or test case litigation when it comes to the use of some of this technology, probably in the European court system. So we are trying to see how we could collect some evidence when it comes to particularly the kind of discriminatory decision making that is perpetuated by this technology, and potentially to challenge it at the international legal level. But I would say stay tuned for that. That's a much longer term project that we have potentially cooking up.
Petra, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been quite illuminating. I really enjoyed listening to you share your insights and your research. And certainly, I think it is fair to say that we should continue to watch what you uncover and hopefully watch as well on the advocacy front, the movements of creating more mechanisms for oversight and accountability. I want to thank all of the attendees for sharing your lunch hour with us today, and especially I want to thank Florian and his team for the invitation to host us and this event. We're grateful that you're giving space to such important ideas and research. Thank you so much, everybody.